Hello there. If you're interested in board game design, you're in the right place. My name is Tim, and I work at the Herrick District Library here in Holland, Michigan. And we just finished up a 3-part class on Introduction to Board Game Design, where people could make their very first board games. We talked about a little bit of how, a little bit of why. But along the way, a lot of our patrons had questions, and I answered what I could, but I'm an amateur. So we brought in somebody who's not an amateur. His name is Geoff Engelstein. You may know his name, but if you don't, let me tell you a little bit about him. Besides designing board games, he's also written several books, textbooks as well, on the topic. He co-hosted the board game podcast Ludology. He teaches board game design at New York University, and he is the president of the Tabletop Game Designers Association. All that to say, Geoff is very qualified to talk about board game design, and he very graciously agreed to answer questions from our patrons about their games. And then a quick note before we begin, Geoff and I had a great conversation over Microsoft Teams. We did have a couple of Wi-Fi issues, so we actually lost our last question, so I'll briefly talk about that at the end. But in the meantime, enjoy our conversation with Geoff Engelstein. Geoff, thank you again so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
I'm excited to be here, Tim. Always happy to talk about games.
So first question there, I figured as we ease into this, you like games. I'm getting that feeling. One of our patrons wants to know, what makes a game a game? You know, what's the difference, I guess, between a game and something else you might do that's not a game?
So that's a really complicated question. It sounds like it should be easy. And you mentioned I did 200 episodes of Ludology, and over the course of that, I had several different co-hosts. And it seemed like each time a new co-host came on, they asked me the question. You know, we did a whole episode on what is a game? How do you define a game? So I've talked about this topic for 3 hours, at least over the course of the year. So I will not bore you with all of that. But I mean, I can tell you for sure that over time, my criteria for what a game is have loosened very much. Originally, I was like, you know, there have to be rules and there have to be choices and there has to be a goal and all this other stuff that I had. And yeah, there's bits and pieces of that, but there's exceptions to just about everything. I think, though, that the fundamental thing is just some kind of structure in the form of rules. That it's the thing that separates it from our everyday activities is just that there's some sort of you can't necessarily take the shortest path from A to B. You know, there's some sort of structure. There's some sort of regulation on the activity. So I think ultimately it's the rules that kind of create a system that kind of separates a game from the other things that we do in our life when it's just totally unstructured and you can just sort of do whatever you want to do.
It is the restrictions or the constraints that make something oddly fun. Like doing whatever you want isn't always the best way to have like a good time.
Right, and games don't have to be fun. There's games that are not fun.
I guess that's
that we still may want to do, right? There's serious games and there's other things, but the best explanation I heard about this was Frank Lantz wrote a book called The Beauty of Games, which I don't know if it's in your library system, but it should be. So a little plug to Frank. But he talked about aesthetics, right, and what games represent as compared to other types of art. So let's talk about and I thought it was, for me, it really unlocked a really powerful idea for me. So the theory is that different forms of artistic expression are ways of us doing things we do in life, but purely not for any utility, right? Not for any use. So, for example, painting, right? If you go to look at a painting, it's using your vision, it's using the sense of vision just to look, not to find a predator, not get hit by a car, not to read a book or whatever, right? It's just the for the pure pleasure of seeing, in a way, right? It would be art. Music is an expression of just of listening. There's many things we use for listening that we have to do that have a purpose. Music doesn't necessarily have a purpose. And you can go down to things that, like, you know, watching a play is about language, or reading is about language, and the spoken language or written language. But these are non-utile ways to do it. So what are games? If games are a creative expression, which I think they are, right? So what are games expressing? And what he proposes, which I think is very true, is that games are the aesthetic expression of systems, of cause and effect. right? Our brains are set up to say, oh, if I do this, then this will happen. If I do this, then this will happen. And we use that all the time to get through our lives and to make plans and to do our jobs and everything else. A game is a way of exercising our system nature of our brains, not for any specific purpose, right? So in the same way that as a painting is to vision, a game is to cause and effect. And so that's kind of fundamentally what a game has to have, is it's got to have that sort of, if I do this, then this is going to happen. And it's and rules are what set up that system and let you play basically within the system and figure out, oh, if I poke it over here, this is going to pop out over there.
That's such an interesting definition, or just way of thinking about it. Like, what is this other person's mind going to do in this situation if I do this first or that first? But it's not, I mean, it feels high stakes sometimes, but it's not. It's a chance for me to just use that part of my brain when I'm not trying to calculate if I'm going to be able to like pay my mortgage or whatever. It's like separate.
Yeah.
Eva wants to know, which part of game designing do you get stuck on the most, and how do you get past it?
So for me, the part that's really kind of the most challenging is the iteration part, I would say. So typically the phases that I go through when I design a game, I have sort of an initial idea, brainstorm, and then I'll quickly, come up with a bunch of ideas and throw together a really quick prototype and put it together. And sometimes it works, or sometimes I realize it was the dumbest thing I've ever thought of and just throw it away or whatever. But, once you get to a certain, when you kind of get past that initial burst, and you have an idea of the framework of what you want to do, and you say, oh yeah, it's going to work, right? Now you've got a pretty an extensive amount of effort that you need to spend to iterate and to tune it and say, do I have enough abilities? Do I have there's enough different things going on, and is it too easy? Is it too hard for players to learn? And where, are they having fun, or are they having the right type of experience that I want them to have? So there's a lot of that kind of fine tuning and constantly iterating on it, and that's the part that I find, just from a motivational standpoint, the most difficult to get through, because it's the longest part, which is why it can be a challenge, like when you're teaching game design or doing a game design course, because usually those cover that initial super fun, let's slap something together phase and try it, but not the super hard work on the other side. So for me to get over that, kind of get through that part of it, I like to work with a co-designer. Because usually if sort of like my energy enthusiasm is going down a little bit, theirs is probably going up. And, between the two of us, we can kind of motivate ourselves to get through the project and see it through to the end. And if we reach a point where we're both not motivated anymore, then that's probably a sign that it doesn't, it's not a project that's worth continuing on. So for me, that's kind of the whole design process. That's always the toughest part to get through. But ideas for me are easy. I've got a giant notebook filled with ideas that I just more ideas than I know I'll ever be able to get to. So occasionally I'll just post them online in the hopes that somebody else will be inspired by them and make a game that I can just play, and I don't have to go through all the work to design it.
That's nice. I think probably if you're watching this and you're a patron who was just in this class, or if you're watching this and you're starting your design, yeah, you may hit that wall. Sorry, we didn't have enough class periods for you to get to that point where you realize, wait a minute, this is a lot of hard work, because we're in the cardboard and markers phase. But yeah, maybe try having a co-designer. That'd be really interesting.
And have fun along the process, And the tip I try to give to students, if you really, want to design a polished game, is that, you're gonna find yourself lost in the woods at some point. You're gonna, you're going to lose track of what it is. And so what I do is, when I first start a project, is I like to write down what I call like a vision statement. It's just like a one paragraph, something got me excited about this idea. Something made me want to do this game about zombies in a mall or whatever, right? And so I write down just 3 or 4 sentences of like why this idea is exciting to me, and how I want the players to feel, and maybe the stories I want the players to tell to their friends when they're done with the game. Oh, it was so cool, we did this and this happened. Just a couple of little things like that. And then I put it in a drawer, and 3 months later, when I'm lost in the woods and I don't know, what to change or what to tweak or whatever, I go back to that piece of paper and I take it out, and I'm like, oh, this is the feeling I wanted. And usually I can say, okay, this part of the game is not helping towards this feeling at all. What can I do to take that out and put something else that'll give more of that idea. So I try to capture that initial spark so I can go back to it later as like a little bit of a North Star. So that's also sometimes helps to get over those humps.
Sounds super helpful. You mentioned you have an idea notebook. I'm sure it's full at this point, just all these different things you've researched. Andy asked, what is your favorite game you've designed that won't be published? And I'm going to expand that question to include maybe you haven't designed it quite yet, but you've got it in there and you just don't feel like, for whatever reason, it's going to be something you take to completion.
Well, I'll give you two. One that is actually fully designed and I'm shopping it around, but so far I've had like a few deals on it, but it hasn't quite happened for a reason that will become apparent probably once we talk about it. And one that's just sort of in the idea stage. But I don't know if you're familiar or folks are familiar, but there's this thing back from when I was a kid that's still for sale today, which is vibrating electric football. I don't know if you've seen. So you can look it up when you're done.
Okay, I will.
There's a company that makes it. They've made it for 75 years. It's a sheet of metal, and it's got a little vibrating motor under it. And you put these little football figures on it, and they run around. When the thing vibrates, they like move around, and then when they touch each other, if one of the defenders touches the guy that has the football, you have to stop the play. So my son and I were like, we love this board. We had this thing. It never works as a game because they just like run in circles. They don't, it never really works out. And so we sat down and we designed a game. It had little special characters and they all had different abilities. And we changed it. So you both had the ball at the same time and you only ran the thing for 3 seconds. You didn't, at a time, and then you could make moves and things like that. Worked great. People love it. It's always, when I bring it to conventions and stuff, people love to play it. It gets a huge crowd. You hold the button down for 5 seconds, and the guys are all, they're moving around the field, and you're screaming and yelling that someone's going to cross over into the end zone or whatever. It's a very, very exciting experience. And we've had a number of companies that are really interested in it. But the problem is that to make the board and the figurines and the whole thing, it's going to have to retail for like $100, something like that. And, I think you're getting a lot of value out of it, and people would play it a ton of times. But, if you're going to buy a board game for $100, and there are plenty of games that cost $100, as you know, but they typically are like 3-4 hour, 5-hour, 6-hour experiences. There's tons of components. It's like a lifestyle kind of a game, right? This one is like a family game that takes 15 to 20 minutes to play. And it's a big giant box because it's got this big board which can't fold because it's made out of a big piece of vibrating metal. So it takes a lot of shelf space in stores, so stores aren't super excited about it. So it's just got a lot of things that are kind of working against it. And we've talked about maybe publishing it ourselves and just selling it by mail or something like that, but so far no go on that. So I love the game, but it's just there's other elements to it beyond just how much fun the game is that are required to really get it out there and published.
I know what you mean about the mismatch between like box size and price and experience, but I wonder if you could find a way to market it more in the realm of like, I don't know, if you bought a foosball table or a little tabletop ice hockey table or something like that, like those. Yeah. If it's more in that thing, like it's a basement fixture,
more like a piece of furniture, yeah.
Yeah, like then it's like I don't know, but I would play that. I would be very interested.
Okay.
I'm
so I'll make sure I rig it.
Yeah. And you mentioned another game as well.
Yeah, so when I published my little book of notes, one of the things I published that got the biggest reaction from anybody, so maybe I will go and try to design it. But it was, I just had 3 words. It was superhero insurance adjuster. And the idea is that you were in a town, you were an insurance agent in a town, and you had to insure buildings, but superheroes and villains were constantly fighting in the town and knocking the buildings over in their big fights. And so you tried to get the superheroes and villains to fight near your opponent's buildings. You wanted to steer the fights in a way that they would knock down the other players' buildings and not your buildings. So that was that was the other game that I've always wanted to do.
Even just from the 3 words at the beginning, I was like, I understand how this game is going to work, at least at a top-down level. I would be curious if that one comes out too. I'm curious about all of these, but hopefully you can push through the.
Maybe
I will. Yeah, that sounds
and
really
hey,
great.
If you're listening to this and you want to design it, knock yourself out. Go for it. I'm not. I will not be mad. Like I said, I'll be happy to play it.
Yeah, I guess if you're in the class and you were like, what, my game isn't really working, we can pivot right there. We got gold. We do have a couple questions about player counts. One of them is about larger groups, one of them is about smaller. Drew wants to know, what are some of your favorite mechanics for large group games, so 8 or more players maybe, or some mechanics you think are maybe underexplored in large group games?
I think there's different things with large group games. There's different levels of them. So I mean, one is just like a classic party game. The thing that you really want to have in a party game is a good spectator role. Either everybody's involved, but if you're not involved, some way to participate in it in some form. And like all the best game shows, for example, will have that. And you could think about a game show as, yeah, there's only 1 or 2 or 3 people on it, but really it's a game for 1 million people to play at the same time, right? And so like if you look at your shows like Jeopardy or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? I mean, a lot of these trivia type games are really structured in terms of play at home, make those decisions along with the players or answer the questions that they would ask. So having like being able to define a spectator role is really good.
On the flip side of the spectrum, Jim wants to know, what kind of things do you think about when you're designing a 2-player game so it has interesting choices that feel fair to both players?
That's a tricky one. I mean, I think there's no hard and fast rules around that. I mean, I think what you want to, it's, because things are kind of zero sum, sometimes, you can decide if you want your game to be where you're just taking stuff away from the other player, or if there are things where you're kind of growing more, where you're both players are sort of getting more powerful. But you don't want to have. There's a huge difference between 2-player games and 3-player games. In terms of the dynamics and things like that. So yeah, with a 2-player game, you actually have a little bit more freedom in terms of what you're doing, and things like losing turns, or if you're taking resources from one player, it's the same as gaining resources in the other player. So there's you can kind of approach it differently. So it's difficult to give really specific advice without knowing it, but I would say for sure that if you're designing a game that can be played either at 2 players or 3 players or 4 players, you've got to look at that 2 versus 3 player boundary extremely closely. So I just kind of leave it at that.
It's like, if I give you this card and it gets you 10 points, that is the same as me losing 10. It does not matter one way or the other, which is hard to wrap your mind around sometimes when you're just worried about your own points. But that is the gap between 2 and 3 being bigger than between 3 and 4 is interesting to keep in mind. We do have question from Faith about a specific 2-player game that they're working on. And Faith says she's developing a game built around 2 players bluffing to each other about how far they can push their luck, basically, against a point value that the one player is setting. She wants to know specifically if you have any advice for emphasizing like the risk reward feeling over like raw numbers and math.
So there's a couple of different, there's 2 different elements, kind of 2 elements to the question there. So first is, in terms of the push your luck aspect, the key thing is that it's not easily calculable what your chances are, right, of doing the next thing. And if it's too easy to calculate what the odds are of succeeding or failing, then you can kind of figure out, well, I should go or not go, because this is what I'll get if I succeed. This is what I'll get if, lose if I fail. And, you can kind of go from there. A simple example is, let's say on the game is you roll a die. If you roll a 1 through 5, you get a point. If you get a 6, you lose all your points. And after each time you roll, you can stop. So the math is pretty easy to figure out in terms of what you should do. And so that's not a particularly interesting game. The game I would suggest that Faith take a look at if she hasn't is called Can't Stop. There's ways to play it online for sure. And in Can't Stop, you roll 4 dice, and you have to make 2 pairs of dice, and you move those markers up on this big number track. And there's a couple of interesting aspects. One, it's very difficult if you are like you have to roll either a 5 or an 8, and you're rolling 4 dice, and you got to make those combinations. It's not obvious. It's not easy to just understand what your chances are of getting that. So I definitely check out Can't Stop as a thing to look at as a reference point. The other aspect is bluffing. So you're talking about bluffing, which I think is different than push your luck. And the key for bluffing is, the key thing to look at is how much information do you have about what the other person is doing, and how does that information kind of leak out of the system. So if you're playing poker, you're getting information from the bets that people are making and comparing that with the bets that they've made in the past. and kind of looking at what you've got and things like that. So you've got to look at the information sources and where is that information and how is that interesting.
To me, those words sound similar, like, oh, bluff, luck, it's all the lucky stuff. But from a design perspective, it really changes a lot about how you approach getting that experience you want. Mackenzie, this is a question I think some of our patrons will have, even if we're still early on in the process. They have questions about tips for fundraising for a game or publishing a game. You know, if they want their game to see the light of day, what would you maybe suggest they do?
Well, there's two basic paths if you want to get a game published. So the first is you go to a publisher and you do what's called a pitch. You go out and you basically, pitch them your game, explain what it is. I'd be happy to come back into another session and talk about that because that's a whole other conversation. But you'd pitch your game to different publishers. One of them may decide that they want to publish it, and you get a licensing agreement. And in that case, they do all the artwork, they do all the printing, they do all the sales and the marketing, and you get a royalty, just like writing a book, and you send it to a publisher and they publish it for you. So that's option one. And that's the way I've done basically all my games is through licenses. The other way is self-publishing, design a game, and then you would be responsible not just for designing the game, but also for doing all of the art and funding the manufacturing and stuff like that. And that's where things like Kickstarter or GameFound or some of these other services come in, which you can use to raise money from people. Because the question then, even if you self-publish it, you don't have to do that, but A, you've got to pay with all your own money, and then B, once you have the games in your garage, how do you sell them? How are you going to market them to people? So Kickstarter gives you an opportunity to have built-in audience and market the game. But it's very difficult for an unknown designer to have a game on Kickstarter that does well and raises a decent amount of money. The expectation for the consumers at this point on Kickstarter for the board game players is that when you put a game up there, that it's basically done, it's ready to go. All the artwork, they want to see the great artwork, they want to see miniatures, they want to see a video about the gameplay, they want to read the rules. They're not like, I've got an idea, it's about a halfway done, but I need another $50,000 to finish my idea, please fund my game. That's not going to happen. People want to see a finished game. And then the other thing about self-publishing is not only you have to, so you got to get to that point where you can set up the Kickstarter and everything, is in the end you're running a business. Right? Do you want to run a business with this game thing, or do you just want to see your game on a shelf with your name on the box and be able to play it with your family and friends? A lot of people go that Kickstarter route and then they realize, oh, I did not want to run a business. I didn't want to have to deal with getting an import license to bring in the games from overseas, or dealing with distributors or product returns, or then people are missing pieces in their game and I got to send it out, or I got to send out invoices, or I got to pay taxes to the state or whatever, right? There's a whole other list of things you have to do if you're starting a publishing company, which is basically what you're doing if you're self-publishing. So it's definitely financially can be more rewarding. If you license a game, you're going to make like $1 to $2 per copy that's sold. And most print runs for hobby games are like 5,000 copies. So you're going to make $5,000 to $10,000 for most games that you license. So you're going to do better than that most likely with if it gets popular with a publishing company. But there's also a lot more risk. You're putting out a lot more of your own money and more time, and you've got all these other activities that you have to be doing. So that's that. Everyone's going to kind of answer that question themselves differently. And I would love to be able to tell you why some Kickstarters are successful and some aren't. And there are people that are much more knowledgeable about that than I am that could give that advice. I see no rhyme or reason to most of it. Some of it just seems like just something just happens to catch on or catch people's eyes or whatever. So it's tough to put your finger on whether you're going to be successful or not.
Sounds like a whole other topic for people. If they want to get really into the weeds, they can.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, last one. I don't know, maybe you've read, maybe you haven't, The Art of Game Design by Schell, but there's a part in it where I really enjoy. He talks about when he was younger being a juggler, like an aspiring juggler, and going to a juggling convention and meeting a juggler who was super, super good at juggling and just looked different than everybody else. And the juggler was like, I feel like I'm this way because I don't copy other jugglers, I copy other things. So like I learned this trick from a flock of geese in Canada, and I learned this trick from watching like figure skaters. And so when I'm thinking about that, it's like, okay, I can get inspiration from games, about games, but also from many other places. What are some areas other than board games that you've drawn inspiration from and you've seen, funnel into your game design?
Like I said, ideas come from so many different places and inspiration. Just, do a lot of reading, traveling, and just looking at stuff and, other activities, weird sports sometimes. You see people that like chase cheese rolling down a hill and some things like that. Hey, is there something I could do with that? Just generally be interested about the world and everything in it. Inspiration and ideas can come from so many different places. You just need to open yourself up to all of it.
So unfortunately, we lost an internet connection during the next question. Briefly, I'd love to tell you about it because I think it'll be really helpful for you in your game design journey. And it was a question from me asking Geoff to elaborate on his time hosting the segment GameTek, which was something he did on the Dice Tower podcast for 15 years, and he still runs it as a Substack publication now. GameTek is a short segment where he would talk about the math and science of gaming. So like in 3 to 5 minutes, he would talk about some math or science concept that illuminated something about games. So probability. So for example, the one I wanted to bring up with Geoff was the idea that randomness in games with like rolling dice and so forth, actually the more dice you roll, the less random it becomes, right? It's counterintuitive, but he explained it really well, better than I'm going to here. But if you want to know how come rolling more dice is less random than rolling one die, go find that episode of Ludology. I'll link it in the description below. And GameTek is also a book. It doesn't have every single episode, but it has some of my favorites. I know we have it here at the Herrick District Library, at least as an ebook, but you should definitely check with your own local library as well. Anyway, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. And if you have more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll answer what I can.